Okay, so we looked at minor piece endgames, and this time we're going to have a look at rook and pawn endings. And once again, the same comment applies that there have been just huge numbers of books written on rook and pawn endgames. I can't possibly hope to compete in like a 10-minute video with the works of the world's greatest grandmasters. So just a couple of examples and some general principles to get you guys started. When I was a kid, I had a book literally called Rook Endings, and it was just this, rooks and pawns on the board. And it was written by Vasily Smyslov, who was a world champion in the 50s and maybe 60s, around that time, and another Soviet grandmaster called Grigory Levenfish, and it was literally 200 odd pages of just different rook endings, and the number of times I flicked through it and looked through it, and goodness me, I remember a lot of the general principles, but wow, big respect to the grandmasters who have to sort of try and memorize all this stuff. But anyway, so probably the most complicated thing that we've looked at so far. Rook and pawn endings come up all the time, simply I think because where the rooks are the last pieces usually to enter the battle, tucked away in the corners, they just don't tend to get taken very early in the game. All right, well, let's see where we go. So some common themes. Doubled rooks, incredibly powerful at the best of times, but particularly in the endgame. So here we've got a position, it's a long way from over, but black is going to be very passive. There's one open file, the E file, in the middle of the board, and white is just absolutely dominating it. And can use it to try and tie the black pieces down a bit. So for example, rook to e7 is then threatening this pawn. Black will have to play rook across. White might then play, perhaps not immediately, but might try to play rook to c7 and then bring the other rook up here. It's probably defendable for black, but it's the idea of double rooks. So double rooks on the same line, particularly the same file. And the same rank. Not very nice. Well, they're very nice if they're yours, but perhaps not so much fun if they're the opposition's. And continuing that idea is the principle of getting rooks on the 7th rank. So a rook on the 7th, or if you're playing black, you'd want to get it on the 2nd. But a rook on the 7th rank is extremely strong. And in this case, once white plays rook e to e7, it's just unbearable for black. So passive. This rook can never move because one of the rooks will take on f7. This rook is going to be tied down to the defense of the queen pawns. But yeah, so doubled up rooks, any old rook on the 7th rank is not very nice, but if you can double rooks on the 7th rank, they'll be pointing at the king position, really nasty. And just remember, if you're playing black, the black 7th rank is actually the 2 on an algebraic board. So it'd be 2 black rooks down here. Very nasty. Oh, okay. So rooks are long-range pieces, the same as the bishops that we looked at before, and they like open files. So the up and down lines, they like open files to be able to roam up and down and create threats. So here's a position, and again, I'm not going to say that it's absolutely over, but it's pretty obvious that black has an advantage here. The 2 black rooks are pointing nicely down the open files. They're ready to invade on the 7th rank to c2 and d2, whereas the white rooks are tucked away in the corner doing not a great deal. I think if it's black to move here after rook to c2 check, the king goes somewhere and the other rook comes down to d2. The game is actually probably dead at that point. If white's to move, maybe rook e1, and then if rook c2 check, rook e2, maybe black can cling on, but it's nasty. Definitely you want to be controlling the open files with your rooks. And the other thing is that a lone rook, should remember, can checkmate a king on its own if the king is trapped by his own pieces. And it's known as a back rank mate. And quite simply here, the following sequence of moves: black will play rook to e1, which is check. White has white has no other move than to capture. And then the other black rook swings down to e1, and it's actually checkmate. The rook is attacking the king, and the king is trapped by his own bodyguard. So watch out for that nasty threat. And this is why you'll frequently find players will just nudge the h-pawn forward a square, or sometimes nudge the g-pawn forward a square at this stage of the game. Just gives the king a little bolt hole, a little place to escape. It's not always a good, earlier in the game, it's not always a good idea because these pawns can become targets. But at this point, yeah, give your king just a square to escape. It's not a bad idea most of the time. Another mating net for the two rooks. Once we've got a rook onto the 7th rank, remember we've got this idea we've seen before of the rook roller. So this rook's guarding the 7th rank. The other rook gets to e8 and it's checkmate because the king can't escape. So we have to be careful for that one. And of course it works in reverse for black along the 2nd and 1st ranks. Ouch. What else have we got here? So, okay, so as with most endings, the objective is to try to promote a pawn. Yeah, so checkmate will come later once you've promoted a pawn. And here's a pattern that will come up with some frequency. In this position, it looks like black's going to be able to take the pawn in a minute, or if white plays rook d1 to defend it, black and king bring the king across. But actually, white's best move is just rook to e8 check, forking the rook and the king. And after rook takes rook, pawn takes rook check. Well, be check when it becomes a queen. So watch out for that one. And curiously as well, if white was, say, the white rook was here, very similarly, rook to c8 actually wins the game in the same sort of way. It's just a skewer. There's nothing black can do to either save the rook or swap them off, and white promotes his pawn. Okay, so some more principles. Rooks can occasionally be caught out. Place a black rook anywhere you like on this board, and with white to play, you will quickly discover that black's rook cannot stop one of the pawns from promoting. If they're on e5 and f5, so a square further back, it's different. Still nasty, but different. But in this situation, the black rook with white to move cannot stop the two pawns promoting, or one of the pawns promoting. It doesn't matter where you put it, even if you put it down here, so that it's behind the pawns. There's nothing that black can do, or the black rook will be able to do to stop these two promoting. So 2 pawns on the 6th rank are very, very strong, usually be too strong for the rook. And again, another general rule, yeah, I'm glad the lines are there, otherwise the position looks a bit silly. You'll want your rook behind your own passed pawns, and you'll also want the rook behind enemy passed pawns. And basically, in the case of your own ones, because you don't want the rook in the way. So this black pawn here on h3 looks very threatening, but as soon as the rook moves off of the queening square, the white rook up there will just take it. Whereas this one here is just helping support the pawn all the way to the queening square. So generally speaking, you're going to be wanting to have your rook behind your passed pawns. Okay, there'll be exceptions. Yeah, we really want to have rooks on the 7th rank. But if you've got a passed pawn, a rook supporting it from behind is usually more useful than having your own rook in the way. So one thing a rook is good at is cutting off the enemy king from a position. So we've only got 1 pawn extra here for white, and it's not an easy win by any stretch. But the fact that this rook is in the middle of the board cutting off the black king will actually help white to probably win the game. Simply because while the black king is cut off, it will allow the white king to slowly but surely guide his pawn towards the queening square. And it will take some time, and the black rook will be there to cause havoc and check the white king all over the place. But it gives white some chance. You should be looking to use your rook to cut off the enemy king from the action if you possibly can. And so just a very, very similar position. In this instance, I think it's probably going to be very, very difficult, if at all possible, for white to win that, because the black king is past where the rook is, and therefore is already in the way. So really worth remembering, use your rooks to try and cut the enemy king off from where the action is taking place, especially if you've got passed pawns. So positions like these two, yeah, I would agree with the next sentence. This is just too difficult and too complicated to go into depth here. Remember, this is really just a course of beginners. If you reach the level of a good club player and you really, really want to go further, then buy some specialist books. I definitely recommend the Smyslov Levenfish book, even if it is 60, 70 years after they wrote it. It's fantastic. But for now, I think it's just remember some of the basic principles. Yeah. Particularly doubled rooks, particularly controlling the open files, particularly getting your rook onto your own 7th rank, preferably both of them, and getting your rooks behind passed pawns, not in front, so they're not in the way. Okay, so pawn wars with rooks. Don't like the look of the first position. Black hasn't been given a rook. Whoops, silly me. Imagine there's a black rook somewhere. Otherwise, it would be easy. And look at some of the other positions. You can use a dice again to decide how many pawns or whatever you are going to have. If there'll be 1 rook or 2 rooks, and just give it a go. Give it some practice and see how you get on. All right, I think that'll do for now. Good luck with your chess.